HOD Political Science, former Dean और हमारे young faculty और students और बहुत आप JNU से आए हैं, बहुत खुशी है क्योंकि JNU में अब कम JNU से आ रहे हैं और बाहर की यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में ज़्यादा आ रहे हैं। बहुत अच्छा है, हमारी खुशकिस्मती है कि यहाँ इतने JNU के फैकल्टी मेंबर्स हैं और आपका प्रभाव यहाँ यूनिवर्सिटी में बना रहे। जिस तरह आपने JNU में ये सिखाया है आपको, ये बहुत गर्व की बात है JNU के लिए। And it is a genuine honor for me to be at this university, at BHU, and to speak under the auspices of the Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay Chair. I am again deeply grateful to my friend and my younger brother and one of the most eminent scholars, and I hope Vice Chancellor of the future, Professor Amitabh Singh, to be. It's not just my hope, but it's a bhavishivani bhi. Let me begin by saying that for anyone who cares about India's intellectual life and indeed about India's civilizational journey, Bharat, BHU is not merely a university in the conventional sense. BHU is an idea. It is an idea about the unity of knowledge and the unity of the nation. It is an idea about how modern education must not sever India from her civilizational moorage. And it is an idea that reminds us that learning is not simply about skill, but also about character, responsibility and public purpose. BHU has always demonstrated this in the 111 years of its founding. In that sense, it is impossible to be here without acknowledging the towering legacy of Mamana Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya ji, the founder of this great institution. Each time I come here, I am amazed at how Pandit Malviya ji set up this university with his passion, with his sense of mission, and with no money. He went, collected the money, sense of enterprise, scholarship, and because his vision was not merely to build a campus, but to build a national conscience, a space where India could prepare itself for modernity without losing her civilizational selfhood, where the pursuit of science and the pursuit of ethics could coexist, and where education could serve not only as an individual advancement, but the larger awakening of the nation. Is this clear, or I can always take up the... Yeah, I am Hisab to मैंने कहा कुछ. See, there is also a deeper symbolism in the fact that this lecture is being delivered at Kashi. Because Kashi for me is not just geography, not just sacred geography. It is a civilizational memory. Kashi reminds us each time that India's relationship with time itself is different. Here time is layered. The past does not vanish. It lives alongside the present. It is not a burden but a resource. Sometimes as wisdom, sometimes as a warning, and often as a provocation to think more deeply about who we are and what we might become. Therefore, I am particularly honored. I am sorry for this lengthy introduction, but I think it's important since I am coming to Kashi and BHU after more than 10 years, more than a decade. Therefore, it's a particular honor to speak under the auspices of the Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay Chair, because Panditji's thought offers us an unusually demanding lens through which to think about India's rise. His integral humanism, about which all of you are aware, reminds us that development is not just about economics, but it is an ethical and social project. development is not only about increasing the size of the national GDP sheet, but about enhancing the dignity of the individual, about harmonizing prosperity with social justice, and about ensuring that in the rise of the nation, we do not leave behind the weakest and the most vulnerable. In many ways, integral humanism is very complementary to Mahatma Gandhi's own thinking on the subject. In today's world, where the language of power, particularly President Trump's use of the language of power, is often stripped of moral vocabulary, and where geopolitics is frequently reduced to the most narrow self-interest, Deen Dayalji's thought offers us something both Indian and universal. The insistence that the purpose of power is not domination but dharma, not in a narrow sense, but as a sustaining principle of order, responsibility and legitimacy. So when we speak today about the civilization, or when I speak today about the civilizational roots of Indian foreign policy of a Viksit Bharat, I must ask a set of questions that go beyond the technical language of Davos or diplomacy. First, how will India secure her interests in a troubled world? How will India manage to deal with great powers, neighborhood challenges and global commons? And we must ask also something deeper. As India becomes more capable, more consequential and more influential, what kind of a power will India be? Will India's rise simply add one more great power in the international system? Or will India's rise add a distinctive civilizational voice, one that can combine realism with restraint, ambition with responsibility, and strength with legitimacy? This is the spirit with which I speak today at BHU, at Kashi, under the auspices of the Deen Dayal Upadhyay Chair, and in the intellectual shadow of Pandit Malviya Ji's founding vision. Why look back to look ahead? I ask you. Because we meet at a particularly turbulent phase in international politics. The global order, which seemed settled after the Cold War, is fragmenting before our eyes. Power is diffusing across multiple centers. Norms that were once governed interstate behavior are contested. Technology is transforming not only the character of war, but the nature of politics itself. We now routinely speak, those who are in the field of international relations or national security, speak of grey zone conflict, hybrid warfare, cyber operations, information dominance, economic coercion, artificial intelligence. The boundaries between war and peace, civilian and combatant, internal and external security have been increasingly blurred. This turbulence has naturally generated anxiety for policymakers and strategic communities alike. And that is why we must step back to reflect. Because we can discover something remarkable. While the instruments of power change, the fundamental dilemmas of strategy do not. The questions really are, therefore, how does a state preserve order without becoming oppressive? How does it use force without losing moral legitimacy? How does it pursue power without undermining justice? How does it maintain stability and rivalry, uncertainty and fear? How does it reconcile necessity with ethics in moments of existential crisis? These are not new questions, they are old as Indian civilization itself. Therefore, India is uniquely placed. Unlike other modern states whose strategic thinking is largely derived from last few centuries, India possesses a continuous civilizational tradition and a reflection on ethics, order, power and statecraft. Therefore, My lecture will argue that ancient Indian texts offer something especially valuable for our times, a fusion of realism and ethics. They reject naive idealism, recognizing the persistence of conflict, ambition and coercion, yet they also reject unrestrained cynicism, insisting that power without justice ultimately corrodes itself. The fusion, I would argue, is the civilizational root of India's best foreign policy instincts, and it should shape the foreign policy of a Viksit Bharat in 2047, 100 years after India's independence. Professor T.P. Singh had first asked me, and I will refer to this because he had asked me, that why don't you give you a lecture on the Hindu theory of international relations. I give it on something broader, but I must refer to the lecture that he pointed out to me, which I had read, but he again pointed out to me, Binoy Kumar Sarkar's 1919 essay, The Hindu Theory of International Relations. Sarkar wrote this essay when India was not independent, a republic or a sovereign, and yet he attempted something ambitious to show that Indian political thought contains systematic ideas about international relations, ideas about sovereignty, strategic calculation, circles of power, and the logic of rivalry. Now, Professor T.P. Singh, I will put you in an embarrassing position by asking your students, how many of you have read Binoy Kumar Sarkar's Hindu view of international relations, Hindu theory of international relations? बताइए कितने ने आप में से ये पढ़ा है? Excellent. So, I hope that the first question from the audience comes from you. Now I'll ask the same question to the faculty members. How many of you have read the Hindu theory of international relations? Ma'am, so the second question will be asked by the former dean of the school. You may agree with Binoy Kumar Sarkar or disagree, but you cannot miss the deeper significance. He was insisting that India could be a producer of theory, not merely of a consumer of other people's categories. People who have come from CPS and have studied or done their supervisions, as Professor Mohanty has under Rajiv Bhargav, or Dr. Jha has done under Professor Valerian Rodriguez, will be particularly conscious about theory, the importance of theory, because often there was a feeling that School of International Relations, SIS, disregards theory. So that's why I would want to encourage you to read this as the Hindu theory of international relations. So that India can be a producer of theory, not merely a consumer of theory. For a Viksit Bharat, this is essential. The Chinese have developed a Chinese view, theory of international relations. Because a developed India cannot remain intellectually derivative. If India has to shape global order, India must also shape global ideas without romanticism and without apology. Sarkar's impulse was to recover an Indian strategic grammar, especially the idea that international politics is not merely law and morality, but also rivalry, fear, ambition and calculation. And it is that grammar that I want to extend today into a modern frame. What should define the foreign policy of Viksit Bharat? An India that is developed, influential and civilizationally self-aware. I propose, and I must tell you that parts of this lecture were delivered in a different form as a chair of excellence as the Defence Services Staff College in Wellington, and to an audience of essentially military officers. But I want to see the response here. I had proposed there, and I propose here, 20 elements. 20 elements not as rigid doctrine, but as civilizational foundations that can inform modern foreign policy. In other words, there are 20 elements of foreign policy of a Viksit Bharat, which I will elucidate here for you quickly, because I know that we don't have so much by way of time, but Professor T.P. Singh has assured me that I can speak for another half an hour.
Sir, it's up to you, sir.
Okay.
I don't have restrictions.
So, Binoy Kumar. So first element begins, many of these elements of a foreign policy begin at home and rooted in India's own civilizational ideas. Remember that when Kautilya's Arthashastra, if you read it, opens with a blunt proposition, and I translate it, the greatest threat to the state is not the external enemy, but the negligent ruler. External adversaries exploit weaknesses, they do not create it. Internal decay is fatal. Kautilya argues that a ruler must be ceaselessly active, reviewing administration, overseeing justice, monitoring officials, managing resources, and anticipating threats. In the Mahabharata, if you remember Bhishma's long discourse on Raj Dharma, he tells Yudhishthira that the king is not merely a commander-in-chief, but the custodian of order itself. When governance weakens, disorder spreads outward like a contagion, eroding social trust, economic vitality, and ultimately military effectiveness. For Viksit Bharat, therefore, foreign policy begins at home. Governance capacity, public service delivery, rule of law, institutional integrity is a strategic asset. Element 2, again internal. Welfare and strategic power in Kautilya's line, it's linked to governance. Praja Sukhi Sukham Raja. Popular alienation is more dangerous than foreign invasion. This is a corollary to number 1. When people lose faith, loyalty fractures and internal unrest becomes a fertile ground for external manipulation. This is, as I said, flows from element number 1. The Mahabharata presents this dynamic with tragic clarity. Duryodhana does not lose the war because he lacks warriors or wealth. He loses because his rule is morally hollow, marked by hubris, arrogance, injustice, and contempt for social norms. When war comes, loyalty within his camp is fragile. By contrast, the Pandavas, counseled by Bhagavan Krishna, command enduring support because they are perceived as rightful and restrained. Element 3. Economic power is the sinews of strategy. Ancient Indian statecraft places extraordinary emphasis on the treasury. Kautilya devotes extensive attention not just to economics, it's as a science, but to agriculture, trade, taxation, mining, forest and infrastructure. This is not administrative pedantry, it's strategic logic. Kautilya is in fact equally blunt here. A king who exhausts the treasury through neglect or extravagance ultimately destroys the state. He understood that power rests on productive capacity. For Viksit Bharat, geoeconomics is foreign policy. Element 4. Matsya Nyaya. Again, one of the most evocative ancient metaphors in the Arthashastra is the Matsya Nyaya. The law of the fish, where the big devour the small in the absence of authority. It is a stark image, but a precise one. It captures a fundamental truth about human societies. Without credible order, power defaults to the strongest, not to the just, a social Darwinianism. Ancient Indian thinkers, including Kautilya, but within the Upanishads itself, order is viewed as a moral good. Law protects the weak, restrains the strong, and stabilizes the society. Internationally, we see today the return of caution, territorial revisionism, Trumpism. For India, therefore, supporting the rules and norms is not just only in the enlightened national interest, A developed India must be an order-building power, regionally and globally, preventing the world from sliding into predation. Element 5, counsel and wisdom. No ruler governs alone. Kautilya understood this with exceptional clarity. The Arthashastra laid out detailed system for counsels of ministers, intelligence network and bureaucratic oversight. If you look at the Mahabharata and the Ramayana itself, they reinforce this lesson repeatedly. Krishna advises Arjuna, at the moment of deep moral crisis, should I fight or not fight? Sri Ram listens carefully to counsel before marching on Lanka. Ravan, by contrast, seals his fate by ignoring wise advice, including by his brother Vibhishana. For Viksit Bharat, this means investing in institutional wisdom, long-term planning, strategic assessment and civil-military coordination. Great powers, as we know from our understanding of history, fail not because they lack capability, but because they misread reality. Element 6. For India, a diverse and plural society, unity does not mean uniformity. It means shared commitment to constitutional order. The Mahabharata warns about fratricidal conflict. Internal division invites external intervention. Element 7. Strategic indirection. One of the most enduring anecdotes with Chanakya concern a simple domestic scene which everyone, even mothers tell their children. After an early attempt to seize Magadha, Chanakya and Chandragupta were in hiding. One evening, Chanakya overheard a mother scolding her child for eating hot dalia right from the center, from porridge from the center, and burning his tongue. She advised him to start from the cooler edges and the ends. Chanakya immediately grasped this as a great strategic lesson. Instead of attacking the enemy's strongest point, the capital, he reorients strategy towards securing the periphery first. Border regions were consolidated, alliances built, and the center isolated. The lesson is timeless. Avoid attacking the strongest point first. Shape, isolate, and exhaust before striking decisively. Ancient Indian wisdom emphasized encirclement, deception, and psychological advantage. This is, in strategy, patience often defeats strength. In long-term competition, shaping matters, building partnerships, strengthening resilience, and denying adversaries easy leverage. For India, strategic patience is method. Viksit Bharat must learn to win without always fighting. Element 8, diplomacy first. Of course, one of the most powerful strategic episodes in Indian literature is Krishna's mission in the Udyog Parva of the Mahabharata to negotiate. Yes, to negotiate with, going to Hastinapur to negotiate with Duryodhana. Not as a warrior, but as a diplomat. He knows the probability is high, yet he goes nonetheless. I mean, of course, that also is part of Kautilya's thing, but in this Mahabharata, he proposes a compromise of astonishing restraint. If you remember the Mahabharata, that Pandavas will be happy not with half the kingdom, not even a quarter of the kingdom, but only 5 villages, one for each Pandava. Duryodhana refuses. Not only does he refuse, he declares that he will not give land enough to cover the point of a needle. Worse, he attempts to imprison Bhagavan himself. At this point, Krishna's role changes, diplomacy has been exhausted, moral responsibility shifts, war becomes inevitable, but crucially it becomes legitimate. This sequence matters most. The Mahabharata does not glorify war. It insists that war must follow the exhaustion of peaceful alternatives. Krishna later tells Arjuna when righteousness declines and injustice rises, action becomes duty in probably the most famous shlok of the Bhagavad Gita as well, Yada Dadaye Dharmasya. This lesson is not pacifism, it is procedural modern morality in strategy. For contemporary statecrafts, this lesson is profoundly relevant. Diplomatic effort before war serves multiple strategic purposes. It clarifies intent, builds legitimacy, shapes domestic and international opinion, and isolates the adversary morally and politically. Element 9 is mandala and the neighborhood. Mandala's realism and the neighborhood, Kautilya's mandala rests on geography. Proximity amplifies consequences, the neighborhood is a structural priority. Mandala teaching, in essence, teaches us about the importance of deterrence plus reassurance, connectivity plus vigilance. It is in fact one of the most first and the most systematic frameworks for understanding IR. It rests on a simple but penetrating observation. Geography shapes political behavior. Again, I can go into it in the discussion about how the mandala theory can be applied today and how India can deal with its neighborhood from the point of view of the mandala theory. Element 10, Shadgunya flexibility. The six-fold policy of Shadgunya rejects rigidity. Strategy adapts to relative strength and timing. You remember the Kautilya in the mandala theory with the Shadgunya, the six-fold policy is peace, war, neutrality, preparation, alliance, and dual policy. The brilliance of this framework lies in its rejection of rigidity. There is no single correct posture. Strategy must adapt to relative strength, timing, and circumstance. Peace may be wise when one is weak or when consolidation is required. In the Chinese thought, hide and bide. War may be necessary when advantage is decisive. Neutrality may preserve autonomy amidst great power conflict. Alliance may compensate for weakness. Dual policy, peace with one, pressure on another, may offer strategic leverage. What a brilliant framework. This is not opportunism, it is contextual judgment. Of course, the next one is something which, ma'am, you pointed out, Samdhan, Dhandabhed, the full spectrum of statecraft. And I won't go to it because everyone is aware of the framework of the Samdhan, Dhandabhed, and the Mahabharata illustrates all four. Krishna persuades where he can, offers compromise where possible, endorses force when necessary, and uses psychological stratagems to weaken the enemy's coercion. A developed India must, a Viksit Bharat must integrate all these instruments in its foreign policy. Element 12, Dharm Yudh. Ancient Indian thought does not reject war, it seeks to discipline it. The concept of Dharm Yudh imposes moral constraints on the use of force. War must have a just cause, legitimate authority.
Sir, please start with.
Yes, thank you. So I am about to, I'll take 5 more minutes, sir.
Please take 15 more minutes.
Let me first of all acknowledge very warmly and respectfully the presence of the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Chaturvedi. Thank you, sir, for your presence. Element 30 is ahimsa and protection. Indian thought holds a profound tension that's often misunderstood. On the one hand, ahimsa is proclaimed as the highest ideal, On the other hand, the use of force in defense of justice is also recognized as dharma. But non-violence is the highest duty, so too is violence in defense of righteousness. This is not a contradiction, it's moral realism. Violence is tragic, but abdication of responsibility in the face of injustice is worse. 14th element is the tragedy of war. The Mahabharata does not, for instance, romanticize war. It shows moral compromise under pressure. It presents as a tragic, morally fraught and costly, even when just. Even as the war progresses, if you remember, the Pandavas are compelled to use deception against an adversary that has already violated all norms. Bhishma is brought down through a stratagem, Drona is broken through psychological manipulation, Karna is killed when vulnerable. Sri Krishna justifies his acts not as virtues but as necessary evils in an existential struggle. For even victory leaves moral residue. Yudhishthira emerges victorious but haunted. The lesson is sobering. Ethics in wars are essential, but in war itself deforms ethics. See, this ancient realism speaks directly to modern dilemmas of asymmetric conflict, cyber deception and information warfare. Do what is necessary, but never forget the cost. Moral injury is real, strategic success must account and justify. Element 15 is Raj Dharma. Ancient Indian political thought is unambiguous on one foundational point. Power is not an end to itself. Power exists to unfold justice, order and the moral fabric of society. The principle is encapsulated in the concept of Raj Dharma. In the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata, Bhishma tells Yudhishthira that the king is the guardian of justice, not its masters. He warns that a ruler who uses power arbitrarily, even if strong, undermines the very basis of authority. Such a ruler may command obedience for a time, but never loyalty. And since I've talked about Danda, but I'll gloss over it. Element 17 often invites a lot of criticism, but it is one of the most sophisticated ideas in ancient thought, which is apadharma, the ethics of exceptional circumstances, which flows from the ethical dilemmas that I talked about. The Mahabharata recognizes that in moments of existential crisis, strict adherence to normal rules may lead to a catastrophe. In such moments, extraordinary measures may be permitted, but only temporarily, only to restore order. This concept explains many morally troubling episodes in the epic. In fact, there is an Oxford philosopher, Bimal Krishan Matilal, who has written a huge essay called In Defense of Devious Divinity. Yudhishthira's partial truth to Drona, Ashwatthama, Krishna's endorsement of deception, and deviations from normal conduct are all justified under apadharma. Yet the text is clear. These actions also, as I said, leave moral residue. They are not celebrated. They are borne as moral burdens. Then, of course, is the whole idea of strategic power as moral authority, as exemplified by King Ashok after the Kalinga War. And, of course, there are revisionist views which suggest that there was opportunism rather than an absolute revision of Ashoka's understanding, but I will not go into it. Maybe we can do so in discussion. Element 9 is something that we have become familiar with, particularly so after the G20 slogan, which is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And this is a part of, deeply embedded in the Indian Upanishads and other forms of ancient strategic thinking. And it's not seen as utopian idealism. It's a recognition of interdependence beyond even human beings. Ancient Indian thinking, including in the Upanishads, understood that prosperity, stability and survival are shared enterprises. And the synthesis, which is an Indian contribution, that realism and ethics are not opposites. Kautilya and Ashoka are often presented as contrasts, the realist and the moralist. In truth, they represent two ends of a single strategic spectrum. Effective statecraft requires us both. This synthesis between realism and ethics is India's distinctive inheritance and our greatest challenge. As India grows, we will face choices where we can impose outcomes simply because we are stronger. The civilizational test is whether India can act decisively without losing moral seriousness. In conclusion, what should define the foreign policy of Viksit Bharat? Let me close by returning to this great university, BHU, to Kashi and to Deen Dayal Upadhyay. If Kashi reminds us that civilization is continuity, BHU reminds us that continuity is not stagnation, it is renewal. And Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay reminds us that the ultimate purpose of power is not domination but dignity. A Viksit Bharat foreign policy must therefore be defined by three intertwined qualities. First, it must be strategically capable, because ethics without capability is helplessness, and autonomy without capability is illusion, maya. Second, it must be institutionally disciplined, because in a turbulent world, strategy is not impulse, it is a habit built through planning, coordination and professional statecraft. Third, it must be ethically serious, because capability without restraint becomes brittle and influence without legitimacy does not endure. If we can combine these strength with restraint, prosperity with justice, autonomy with responsibility, India's rise will not merely be in addition to global power, it will be contribution to global order. That, in my view, is the civilizational meaning of India's foreign policy for a Viksit Bharat. Thank you. Jai Hind.